following Brexit. Now, obviously, it was incredibly timely because just this afternoon we had Brexit Britain at the Conservative Party conference, launched with speeches by Theresa May, Boris Johnson and David Davis. And even more timely because we journalists take great pride on producing scoops. These are stories that nobody knows about and turn out to be absolutely right. But we have been completely scooped by the Centre for Social Justice and the Legatum Institute, because Theresa May talked today about launching a great reform bill that would repeal the European Communities Act of 1972 and bringing all the acquis communautaire into UK law. And it turns out that you guys said that in a report on Friday. Although I noticed you were missing one detail. You called it the repeal bill, not the great repeal bill. So one little quibble there. It wasn't a total scoop. But also you had another very, very important report which will actually form most of the basis of our discussion today, which was Healing a Divided Britain. And this was looking at how, obviously it wasn't exactly divided 50-50 because it was 48-52, but talking about the very real divisions within our society that go far deeper than what we think about membership of the European Union. So, to discuss these matters, we have a very learned panel. Sitting right next to me here is Philippa Stroud, Baroness Stroud, the Chief Executive of the Centre for Social Justice. And I think it's fair to say that Philippa really has been, over the last decade, one of the intellectual driving forces behind really what was launched by Ian, sitting over there just a decade ago, about the Conservative Party changing the way it did things and getting out there and championing the vulnerable, and Philippa Stroud really has been the driving force behind that. James O'Shaughnessy, Lord O'Shaughnessy, former key member of the Downing Street Policy Unit, also did a lot of the thinking, helped David Cameron in the run-up to the 2010 general election. We've got Julia Unwin, Chief Executive of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which means that Julia really on this panel is a figure who's above politics, she's above the fray. Sort of not quite a political, important to say that. Former member of the Housing Corporation and I believe former chair of the Refugee Council. And then finally, down there we have Martin Howe, QC. And I think basically the best way of thinking of Martin is he's basically a bit of a guru when it comes to legal matters and the European Union and the European Court of Human Rights. You go to these events and there is Martin, he's sitting there, phenomenal expertise. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each member of our panel to sort of set out their overview in answer to the essay question for about 7 minutes, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. And if Julia doesn't mind, I'm going to ask her to kick off proceedings. So thank you. Julia Unwin.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you for this opportunity to work with CSJ and the Legatum Institute. Joseph Rowntree Foundation is a charity with a long and interesting history focusing on issues of poverty, community and place. What better time for us to focus again on those issues with the big wake-up call we had on the 23rd of June, which has so often been described as the great surprise, the great shock. Well, it wasn't a surprise and it wasn't a shock to an organisation based in the north of England with a large service provision in Hartlepool where we employ 100 people. We know that there are parts of the UK that have felt left behind. And the research we published at the end of August, which was done by Matt Goodwin for us looking at, I'm sorry, getting the names right, and Oliver Heath, using the British electoral study, told us stuff that I think many of us in this room sort of knew. Yeah. We knew that there were divisions on the grounds of age. The position of people over the age of 65 would be very different from the position of people under 25. We knew that there were differences in terms of income, that was a major divide. And we tracked in that, I think, really significant study, the differences that people's voting intentions made in terms of income. We knew there were differences in terms of education. All of that came together in a report that we published describing this wake-up call. It tells us something that we need to do, but the most important thing it told us in terms of division was the divisions in terms of place. And where you lived mattered more. Put simply, if you have a degree and you are in Hartlepool, you are were more likely to vote to leave than if you were in London. That's because of the opportunity that faces you, the sense of openness, the sense of chance to do different things. And I think what our report drew real attention to was both the lack of opportunity in some parts of the country and the very real precariousness that many people feel. Now, both of these can be hugely overstated, And we have to acknowledge at every stage that we're people with degrees, with very high incomes at every age, who voted to leave just as they all wanted to remain. But in this study, which was 31,000 people, we surveyed them and discovered that these were the fault lines, which is why I think the title of today's session matters so much. It has been a real call to pay attention to the places in the UK that have for far too long been overlooked, and in which the people there feel that they will continue to be ignored. There are, it seems to me, a number of risks and a number of great opportunities in the months and years that lie ahead. There is a risk that the great vortex of energy that will go into delivering Brexit will take the eye off the hugely important agenda of social reform that the Prime Minister has set out today. There is a real risk that all energy will go to that place. But there is also a great opportunity to focus the ways in which we negotiate, the ways in which we craft a new settlement, to be a country perhaps more at ease with itself, to use an earlier Prime Minister's phrase, a country in which people are more protected from economic shocks, more able to survive the very real precariousness of our current labour market, the very real uncertainty that people face in very insecure jobs, a world in which we can start to manage the very high costs that are faced by poorer households. The Institute for Fiscal Studies tell us that every 10% reduction in the pound is a 2 or 3% increase in the cost of living. And of course, that is a much greater increase in the cost of living for poorer households, for whom essentials are so much bigger part of their budget. We published something in early September, which is on your chairs at the moment, which was titled, "In a bold and audacious way, we can solve UK poverty." We believe that the agenda that we are now pursuing, the negotiations that we are now going through, need to be focused on how we end the scourge of poverty facing 13 million people. There are opportunities to do so. We will be renegotiating trade agreements. We will be looking at the nature of our labour market again. We will also be looking at the nature of those places that voted to leave. This is an opportunity which those places really need to benefit from this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. And now I'm going to call on Philippa, please.
Nick, thank you. And thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and also to JRF for sponsoring this evening as well. We are hugely grateful for your support. Straight after the vote of June the 23rd, if you turned on your television, probably what you would have heard was a state of utter confusion, with those political and media commentators who normally try and explain to us what the British people are saying and thinking, utterly perplexed by what had just happened. The CSJ, though, similar to what Julia has just said, was not surprised. We took a neutral position on the issue of Brexit, but we are not neutral on the issue of poverty. And we are connected up and down the country by 350 voluntary sector organisations who we talk to and try and constantly take the pulse of the nation through. And we therefore focused our attention on what would be in the best interest of the bottom 20%. That means we were listening to what they were actually telling us, which was why on the morning of the 24th, when most of the Westminster village was reeling, we were surprised but not stunned. We did understand, though, that we would need to bring the two sides of this vote back together again. Until this happens, it would be hard to go forward as one nation. But to bring the 48 and the 52% back together again actually means we need to understand one another and we need to listen to one another. And it's for this reason that the CSJ and the Legatum Institute decided to embark on an analysis of the vote with the aim of handing it to the PM on the first day of her being Prime Minister. Now that process happened a little faster than we were actually anticipating, so we managed to get it done for conference rather than for her first day. So what did the vote tell us? There's a lot of data in the two documents on your chair. And there's a lot of polling data in particular. And there are two themes of division that I want to very quickly touch on. The first is economic division, and the second is social division. There's a clear story that runs through the work that we have done that shows a difference and a division between those who have benefited from globalisation and the EU project and those who had nothing to lose by voting to leave. At every level of earning, there's a direct correlation between household income and your likelihood to vote to leave the EU. 62% with incomes less than 20,000, 62% of incomes with less than 20,000 voted to leave. This fell in steady increments until by the time you have an income of 60,000, that percentage was only 35%. The Ashcroft polling found that 57% of voters in the more affluent AB, that's senior professionals, that 57% of that demographic voted to remain, and only 36% of voters in the C2 and DE voted remain. So the only group that voted remain were the AB professional group. On social division, you've got a picture that is diametrically opposed. Again, in Ashcroft's polling, we found that 80% of Leave voters view multiculturalism, immigration, and social liberalism as forces for ill. Exactly the same percentage, 80% of Remain voters view these as forces for good. 2/3 of Leave voters think freedom of movement should be curbed, and again the same figure of Remain voters, 2/3, think that it's absolutely fine. So when we started looking at this very divided social picture, we started trying to scratch underneath the surface of it. So what we did was a more qualitative poll, a Vox Pop Me poll. Now, a Vox Pop is actually a Birmingham company, so I'm going to shout out for the Vox Pop company. And they told us a really interesting story. The Leave voters were not anti-migrant, but they were anti the impact of uncontrolled immigration. They viewed immigration as a driver of many of the problems they experience around public services, job security, school places, access to healthcare, and housing. We're just going to play you a very short video with some of their voices.
The issues at a local level that made me vote Leave was the fact that obviously when you book a doctor's appointment or a dentist appointment or actually try and get your kid into a local school, they're literally just too busy.
If we have less people from the EU, obviously these jobs would be then available for the people who actually live in the local area.
I don't think a great nation such as Great Britain should be controlled by Brussels. I think we need to stand alone and make trade with the rest of the world and not be controlled by them.
Issues at a local level that influenced my decision in the way I voted in the recent referendum were children's services and adult services.
I feel that if we leave the EU, then we've got more chance of British people having jobs, good education for their children, more money in their pockets.
The main issues that made me vote Leave was I was seeing our workforce was being depressed financially. The rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer.
Locally it was a job issue. I've got lots and lots of friends out of work.
Because I just think we'll be better off. I think we're an awesome country. We've got some awesome things going off in this country. And I don't think we need the EU at all, really. I think we'll be a lot better off.
The reason why I voted Leave is because I felt it was time to take back control of our own borders and our own rules and regulations and laws that we make in the country. It's about time that we actually made decisions for ourselves.
Fascinating to hear it firsthand from actual Leave voters. But the Remain voters, they perceived immigration as a good thing and were passionate in the defence of its benefits. They often viewed their actual identity as someone who valued diversity, Remain voters saw the EU as a shield, protecting the UK from potential cuts to employment rights and wider infringements of their human rights, which is why Theresa May is so right in doing the review of employment law. So they often worked in employment environments with a diverse workforce, and Remain voters felt that it was just common sense to be part of a club, with some saying, I believe we are stronger together. Watch this.
I voted Remain because I'm a staunch believer that we are a small country and we are better when we work with our neighbours.
I chose to vote Remain because I don't trust the UK government at all, and I think they need to be accountable. I think they need somebody watching over them in terms of the EU to kind of keep them accountable.
If we are out of the European Union, then we would lose all bargaining power and all trade deals. In my opinion, it's better to have a seat at the table than none at all.
I don't think the whole immigration thing was an issue. I live in the northeast. There's not really that many immigrants up here, and even if they are, they're my doctors or the I don't really want rid of them.
The issues that make us vote to stay in the EU are issues like fair working practices and equal rights for men and women, and these are all things that have been brought in by the EU government.
Felt that if we left, it could cause problems with workers' rights being actually diminished and making it easier for companies to, strip workers their rights and sort of like dismiss them really quickly and easily without any comeback.
So we just thought it would be really helpful for you to see the two different voices there coming through, because if we're going to bring them back together again, we absolutely have to understand people's different perspectives. I'm now going to hand over to James, who's going to unpack it further for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippa, and thank you both to the CSJ for being fantastic partners in this report, and to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation for supporting this evening. For those who don't know, the Legatum Institute is a charitable think tank that comes up with ideas to help move people from poverty to prosperity, and it's as a senior fellow of that think tank that I have been involved in this report. For me, today marks a turning point. We now have much greater clarity from the PM about the way forward on Brexit. And we can stop arguing about process, about whether or not we'll have second referendums, and start planning for the future. But the first message that I want to convey from 4852 is that our future is not simply about our relationship with Europe and the world. This is what Philippa and I called in a joint article, the multi-season high drama box set of the EU negotiations, Article 50, FTAs, all the sexy stuff that inevitably pulls in politicians and commentators' attention. But for me, the most important consequence of the Brexit vote is what it said about not our relationship with the world, but our relationship with one another. One of the things I've found most distasteful about the response from people who refuse to accept the result is their attitude of the reasons why people voted. Instead of actually trying to understand why people have done what they've done, they have said they've been duped or they were sold a false prospectus. It's not only insulting, but it's intellectually lazy. Because if you only look, and I think what the work of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has done and some of the work that we have brought together in this report, you will find an incredibly interesting story, some important truths about where we are and who we are as a country. Like the majority of people in this country, I voted to leave, but for a mixture of reasons. And as Philippa has outlined, the reasons that people feel as they did and voted as they did for the European Union aren't just about the EU, but reflect something much deeper about our country. Immigration was undoubtedly a motivating factor, and you only need to look at the polling, immigration comes up over and over again. But it wasn't, I don't think, because of a fear of the other. Rather, as Philippa has explained, it was actually motivated by more everyday concerns. Difficulty getting a doctor's appointment, shortage of good school places, not enough housing, job insecurity. These are the things that actually motivated people to vote. And this is not the stuff of EU negotiations, but this is the stuff of domestic policy. And that really is the big story for me, that comes out of this research, that it is not simply about us redefining our relationship with the world, but about having what Theresa May has called a social reform agenda that tries to bring our country back together. Our report suggests that on the economy, the vote signified an aversion to crony capitalism in which CEO pay never seems to stop rising, and yet ordinary workers' pay has been stagnating. That's why less well-off families were more likely to vote Leave, I think. And the EU, critically, was not seen as a bulwark against this economic failure, but as actually accentuating it. Just look at the scale of the vote for Leave in places like Redcar and Port Talbot. In societal terms, it's undoubtedly the case that the biggest change that people want is on immigration. It's why the PM was right to say that we, if she didn't say it exactly, to imply that we won't be able to remain a part of the single market. It's simply not compatible with ending the freedom of movement of people. I think actually probably this is going to be quite welcomed by the EU because it will mean that they can keep their 4 freedoms intact. And so this clean Brexit provides us with the opportunity to redefine what we do on immigration properly. But of course it doesn't solve the problem of what we do about the NHS. One of the quotes in our report is somebody said, if the £350 million or the extra money that we've been paying to the NHS, to the EU doesn't go to the NHS, I'll go mad. And there is a sense in which that whatever happens as a result of the EU, whatever happens as a result of the money we get back, there needs to be a much greater focus on public service reform, but in the context in which we're still borrowing £70 billion a year. And then finally, on politics, there's no doubt that trust in politics and elites is at an all-time low. And think of the amazing array of leaders who were trying to persuade us to remain, who people were happy to go against. And clearly this is something that is common across the political world, across the world. It's not just happening in the UK. The sense in which national governments are unable to stem the tide of globalisation, and that sense of gaining back control is a really meaningful concept for people who feel that their lives are affected by things that are increasingly not in their control. So the question is, what can we do about it? Together as our think tanks, we're doing more and more work on this, of course. We've got a lot to do. We've got a social reform agenda to try and fill in for the government, but some early ideas. On the economy, we need to be taking on vested interests, and they can be in a number of different realms. They can be in government, they can be in the economy, and they can be in areas which are really difficult for the Conservative Party in particular, like housing. But we clearly need to take on those vested interests to give people a stake in their future, because that is the only way ultimately you can quell anxiety. We need to look again, I think, at our our welfare state and the social services. Are we able to redesign them so that they more accurately reflect the original settlement on which they're based, which is, to some extent, you get out what you put in. And that would be a massive change in the way that we think about public services. And then finally, we need a new political settlement. Interestingly, globalisation, the internet, these were all meant to promise that we'd be able to have political action operating over huge realms. All over the globe, we'll be able to act with others. Interestingly, I think it's had the opposite effect. We now really only trust people who we know and see on a regular basis. And the consequence of that is we really need to radically devolve political power down to individuals and families, to communities, to the lowest possible levels as a bulwark against those big global trends. As Nick mentioned, I used to work for David Cameron, and he used to talk about giving people more power and control in their lives. Well, Theresa May uses different language, but I think the intention is the same. And this surely must be the focus of her social reform programme, which is the pursuit of that great conservative ideal to make people more free and secure in their lives. And that is the ultimate message of 4852. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. I'm now going to call on Martin, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I also would like to thank the CSJ and the Legatum Institute for putting on this very timely and well-focused event, and also for inviting me to say a few words at it. And I'm just going to do two things. One is I'm going to comment on a couple of aspects which are of leaving the European Union, which are particularly relevant to, if you like, the bottom 20% economically of our population. And secondly, I'd like to do a little bit of unpacking of the implications of the 3 points that the Prime Minister made in her speech this afternoon regarding the legal processes under which we leave the European Union. So first of all, what impacts most, and impacts in a positive way, the bottom 20%? And the subject of migration, of course, has already been much mentioned, and we should recall that the British economy has been enormously successful over the last 7 or 8 years in creating large numbers of unskilled jobs. And at the same time, the great majority of those extra unskilled jobs have been filled by unskilled labour migrating from other European Union countries. And therefore, the ability to exercise control over migration, to make sure that migration occurs with skills and in fields of industry where it's beneficial to this country, but is controlled where it is not, must accrue to the advantage of the particularly the people who have been felt suffering with depressed wages, increased costs of housing because of the influx. Secondly, another area not mentioned yet, but very, very significant. One decision we need to take on leaving the European Union is about the common customs union, the common system of external tariffs. And there are those who suggest that the United Kingdom ought to do some sort of deal in order to stay inside the common customs union. Now, I think there are rows and rows of arguments against this course, one of which is to make it nigh on impossible for us to do any independent trade deals. But it has a particular impact on low-income families for whom food is a major part of their family budget. Because the areas where the EU's external tariffs are high, amongst the highest, are in agricultural produce of various kinds. And in many areas of agricultural produce that we actually don't grow or produce in this country. And it would therefore be sheer madness to continue with the same high tariff structure after we've left the European Union and don't have to. Now, with those remarks about particular policy areas, I'd just like to turn to the 3 points made by the Prime Minister. And the first point was about timing, the invocation of the Article 50 exit procedure, and very significant that she has committed herself and the government to starting this process by March next year at the latest. And I think this hopefully dispels the sort of feeling of possibly indefinite drift that we were suffering from until now. Personally, I'd like to see it a bit earlier because I think there's an advantage in doing it on the 1st of January, so we leave at the clean end of the EU budget year. But never mind, what's 2 or 3 months paying another £350 million a week into the EU budget between friends. But the implication, though, of starting that gun is that the structure of Article 50 is such that it provides, hopefully, for an agreement relating to the conditions of withdrawal, but it does not guarantee that such an agreement will be reached. And therefore, a country that invokes Article 50 absolutely must be ready and prepared, if necessary, at the end of that 2-year period, to be able to leave with no agreement. If you're not ready, willing and able to leave with no agreement, you simply have no negotiating power whatever. You have to bend over and accept whatever terms are imposed on you. Therefore, it does seem to me the implication of starting that process is that the country, and the of course the government machine, must be ready to leave at the end of that point, if necessary, on WTO terms. A deal with the EU would be better, but only the right kind of deal, and no deal is better than a bad deal. Secondly, she mentioned the Great Repeal Bill. Now, an important caveat on this will repeal the 1972 Act, which of course brings into force European law in this country, but it will come into force on the day we leave. And I think this differs from proposals that have been put forward by some people to repeal that Act in advance of the day we leave. And by the way, their proposals I personally see a lot of problems with, but I don't want to divert my limited few minutes onto that particular avenue. But the government is committed to going through the process of Article 50 and repealing the Act on the day we actually leave the European Union. And I think the Prime Minister here is some sort of forgivable hyperbole, because the effect of leaving the European Union under Article 50 is that European Union law simply disappears. We're no longer bound by it, or bound by the decision of the European Court. Actually, we wouldn't need to repeal the 1972 Act to produce that effect, but it's good to tidy it up. But the real significance of this Act will be in what it does in terms of maintaining continuity of the law. Clearly, we can't simply in one fell swoop wind the law back to what the law was in 1972 before we joined, and that there do need to be a lot of decisions taken within the next 2-year period about what aspects of the existing law, our domestic law that's derived from Europe, we want to carry forward, either as it stands or amended, and perhaps in some areas to end it. Finally, and the third point, which was interesting and encouraging, was the Prime Minister's firm commitment that we should become, after Brexit, an independent sovereign country with freedom to make our own decisions. And she particularly highlighted the free movement of persons and migration issue. But I think that this statement has other implications, because again there have been moves on certain quarters to suggest that the United Kingdom should stay a member of the European single market. And I use that phraseology carefully, because there's a big difference between being a member of the single market and having external access to it via a trade arrangement. A trade arrangement in principle covers the sale and supply of goods and services to and from your trading partners. The single market is a totally different legal construct. It covers not just trade between member states of the European Union and the other EEA member states. It covers the whole of their domestic markets. It would mean that we would have to continue to apply huge areas of EU-derived regulations in our law after we left for an indefinite period, not only as they stood at the date we left, but we would be obliged, effectively under the machinery of the single market, to adopt new laws and regulations, even ones where we had not had a vote on it. We would be forced via a little-known mechanism involving a funny little court in Luxembourg called the EFTA Court, in effect to follow judgments of the European Court of Justice even after we had left. And finally, in a very severe, in my view, damaging consequence of staying inside the European single market is that it would make it almost impossible for us to conduct serious trade agreements with non-member countries. The reason being, for example, if we wanted to do a deal with the United States of America under which we gave their financial institutions access to our market on a mutual recognition basis, in return to which our institutions give access to their market, we would not be able to do that because the obligation of the single market would be to only license financial institutions under the terms of the relevant single market measure. So I think, looking and drawing what I can from the Prime Minister's speech, Whilst it is clear that the government will be pushing for arrangements with the European Union which do allow continued cross-border trade, both in goods and services, it does look to me as if continued membership of the European single market, one of my favourite bugbears, is probably ruled out from this afternoon onwards. So, ladies and gentlemen, those are my implications that I draw from the limited text of the speech itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Okay, so I'm now going to open it up to the floor for questions. I think, do we have a roving microphone or two or anything like that? We do indeed. There's my beautiful assistant. So, who would like to ask a question? Can I see any takers? I can. I can see the gentleman in the glasses just there. And it'd be great if you could tell us who you are and where you're from.
Good evening. Gerard Lyons, I'm an economist with Policy Exchange. Just to say I agree with everything Martin Howe just said, but therefore I probably should ask the question to Martin. But he's right about the need to stay outside the single market if we're to really address these issues. But the question I'd like to ask is, migration in economic terms, if we limit it over time, should naturally allow unskilled wages to start to rise in the UK because they've clearly been suppressed. And also one of the big problem areas in the last 2 decades in the UK is because UK companies have been able to access skilled workers and unskilled workers from everywhere, we've spent less and less on training. So over time, in economic terms, training should pick up. But the question I'd like to ask you is really the regional dimension and the quick wins in regional terms. The data shows skilled workers under 30 leave in net terms every city in the UK apart from Bristol and London. They're attracted to those magnets. How do we actually address that issue as well as the other issues facing unskilled workers in the regions? And if you've got any quick wins, that would be fantastic. But it's a great report, and thank you for a great set of presentations.
Thank you. Right, so unskilled labourers, regional dimension. Philippa, are you happy to go and answer Gerald? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. One of the really interesting charts in the second report actually that we put on your chair actually demonstrates that inward migration of the first wave of EU countries actually was a net contributor to Britain. But it was when we opened up to a wider membership that actually that fell away and the balance became distorted. So it's just a really interesting thing for us to note as we're doing this evaluation that was taken from Treasury figures that I think have just been published. In terms of training, one of the things that the government really needs to put an emphasis on is in-work training. And we're doing a piece of work at the CSJ at the moment looking at what will happen with a rising living wage and pretty stagnant productivity, that actually it's absolutely crucial that we make those employees worth £9 an hour, because otherwise our great jobs miracle story will turn into not quite such a great jobs miracle story. And we really need that to be regional as well. So one of the challenges, for instance, that we have put at kind of Durham University's doorway is to say, why are you allowing all your graduates to come south? Why are you not actually investing in them, helping them to stay in the area and bring about regeneration in that area? So I think there are a number of things that can be done.
Julia, would you like to
I wanted to add to what Philip has said. There's a very big issue facing all of the cities of the UK, except, as you rightly say, London and Bristol, about their stickiness, the extent to which they manage to retain the skills that they have there. And that's a challenge for all the city regions as they're doing their economic planning at the moment. Many of them are doing great things, Durham's being one that is trying to think it through. Newcastle and Manchester are working really hard on this, because unless they can do that, the economic plans they have will falter. And so for me, it's about migration within the country as well as externally coming in, that we need to factor into this. And that's, I think, what makes the cities so important in this agenda. If we ignore the role of cities, economic drivers of growth, with a real choice about who they retain, who they attract, and what sort of offer they make to them. I think we will fail some of the tests that the 52% put to us.
James?
Yeah, just briefly, just a quick sort of look ahead to the Gartson Institute publication coming out, actually, our UK Prosperity Index, is coming out next week. What that finds is that there is a big problem with urban areas actually translating wealth into prosperity, which is bundled up in this idea. And one of the reasons for that is a lack of life chances, or rather a poor, limited life chances. If you look at the DFE most recent white paper, there's this thing called achieving excellence areas, and these are areas where schools, there's no sixth forms, or no schools are good or outstanding, this kind of thing. There's a correlation between these kinds of areas and the areas that you're describing. And so for me, a big part of this is actually getting the schools right. And that's what I mean about this almost being a domestic reform. The consequences that come out of this are domestic reform, and actually looking at how we can improve schooling in those kind of areas as a way of actually turning those cities into engines of prosperity rather than leaching the prosperous bits to London and Bristol.
Thank you. Martin, do you have thoughts on this, or should we save you up for a legal question? Save you up. Okay, let's have, I think, is Ian Duncan-Smith happy to say a word or two? Should we just wait for the microphone to get to the front row? Have Ian Duncan-Smith here. Yes, do you want to?
I think I'll do it here quickly, easy. Sorry, I didn't...
Oh, take the floor. Talk for as long as you want. You're Ian Duncan-Smith.
No, I just wanted to say, in answer to Jared's question, the second paper has a substantial section, which I wrote, on migration. And the reason I wanted to just say a few words about this is because this is quite important. What has happened, actually, has been a complete underestimate of the impact over the last few years of the effect of not just acknowledged migration into the UK on the lower income levels, which you know, but it's also the other group of temporary migration, which has probably had even more damaging effect on incomes. And the effect of that in the paper, and the latest figures from HMRC, finally we're beginning to get to the bottom of this, which I had at DWP, we had an issue about this, is that the vote that's in the 4852 is one of the most rational votes that they made over this, for a very good reason. The reason why the divide over migration is so stark, which is for groups in higher income they think it's okay, and for groups in much lower income they don't, because the effect is completely different. The chart in the piece that we wrote shows that the net contributors, Philip made the point about it, for those countries that have probably formed the original six, by and large they do contribute more tax than they take in benefits. But for the other group, which make up mostly the East Europeans, they pay less in tax, and there's a reason for that. They tend to take low-skilled and part-time work, and they claim immediately the benefits, but that becomes very clear, both mostly in work, but there are some out-of-work benefits. And the net effect of that is that actually they pay less because they work officially fewer hours, and they claim more in benefits. The total is therefore a cost to the UK, but the worst bit is they then drove the salary levels down. That had an effect, my view, which is the next thing about the problem about the economy, which is we have one of the lowest skilled economies in the Western world, and it's been a puzzle, but it's becoming clearer now that the effect of this over the last 10 years has actually been very negative, in the sense that businesses have got quite lazy about training the workforce to make them more productive, because if you can fish into a pool that allows you to get cheaper labour, you don't have to do it. That was aided and abetted by the tax credit system, which universal credit will change. So the net double effect of this is that not only do they see their wages fall, but there was literally no effort whatsoever to train people to make them more productive as a result. So it's been a double whammy on the economy. So the most rational choice people made was to try and change that, and Westminster wasn't listening to them, and I think that's what comes out of the pamphlet 4852. But it's also a reality that a work permit and cap system that is really about the low-skilled workers, in other words, making sure that there are people here in the UK can do the work before you start bringing people in and at a set level of wage, whereas you have massive flexibility at the high skill end, and you're not that concerned about them, and particularly science and engineering and all those really very skilled areas. And so that balance and flexibility isn't about hard borders, it becomes about access to work, which is in actual fact what the real issue was, what Philippa said earlier on. It's not about I don't like a migrant, it's I really don't understand why my salaries haven't risen or have actually fallen, And that's the thing that I dislike most of all. Take that away, you'll have a lot more cohesion.
Thank you very much. Speech by Ian Douglas-Smith for free. I'm going to take questions together now because we're running out of time, but we have John Penrose, so I'm going to ask John Penrose to go first.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask whether, in the view of the panel, this point about the cry of rage and frustration from the bottom 20%, I think as James put it, and the fact that it therefore knocks through onto social policy, whether or not there isn't a sweet spot there alongside any retraining which we may need to do to raise skill levels in turning Britain into a much lower cost producer, if we can address some of the vested interests over real estate and housing costs, over utilities costs, and over energy and transport costs. If we can reduce those costs, then for a given income, people will be better off, and at the same time it makes us more internationally competitive at a time when we're going to be raising our cost of wages anyway.
Thank you, John. And we have the woman in the front row here.
So you spoke about...
Sorry, could you tell us...
Oh, sorry. Hi, Gresham. I'm a consultant. Obviously, Brexit has lots of its own challenges and opportunities, but with a particular thought to the bottom 20% of earners, what's the kind of one policy or one objective that you'll all be lobbying the government to try and incorporate in their Brexit negotiations to protect their interests?
Thank you very much. And I think we've got the gentleman just down here in about the fifth row.
It was just, I found the work of the CSJ inspiring over the last decade, and I congratulate Ian Douglas-Smith for the amazing work they've done. I'm speaking as an employer really, and I must meet 1,000 employers a year, most of whom have a revolting disregard for their workforces. They're inspired by North Carolina Aerospace, where workers there were moved from McDonald's for $1 an hour to then work in a very high-value industry. We attempted in the UK to roll out a program across 4 universities in the north of the UK and Scotland, and we lifted their home-based salary from £7.50 an hour to £10. The material effect on the selection process was quite profound, and my sense of it was that they, and of course not all of those people were English or Scottish, they were from all over Eastern Europe and Asia. But my sense of it was that the mere extension of dignity to those people made an exceptional effect upon their input to the company, to the point where they then willingly wished to enter summer internships, not even asking for salaries, even though we always maintain a rate of $1,250 a month. But my sense is really that the missing link in the lower end of the workforce is the absence of a mutual state of dignity, which I seem to recall was the founding premise of the welfare state. And I don't think you can expect workers to work in a state of dignity if you have employers that are trying to compress wages. And that answers the question why we're all very surprised as to the result of Brexit in regard to that aspect of globalisation and its impact on low labour.
Thank you very much. So food for thought there. Anyone who obviously wants to address what Ian was saying, particularly from Reshim and John on the bottom 20%, and then what the gentleman there was saying about dignity and work with. I'm going to begin with Philip, and I'm going to just sort of put a little bit of a cheeky journalist sort of spin's the right word, a little thought on the bottom 20%. Obviously that is what the CSJ is all about. But Theresa May, she seems to be talking about a slightly higher income groups. I mean, I was reading today that the people that she wants to champion are people who expect to take at least one foreign holiday a year, and if they're concerned that they might not be able to take that. Now, I don't think the CSJ is concerned about foreign holidays. I think the CSJ is concerned about putting hot meals on tables. So, if you could just bear that in mind when you answer those points. Thank you, Philippa.
Absolutely. We are absolutely supportive of Theresa May's emphasis on those who are only just managing, including those who are taking their one foreign holiday a year. But we would also say to her, do not forget the bottom 2 deciles, that actually if we are going to move forward as one nation, we all need to move forward together. Just picking up on the questions, John, you asked about driving down costs, absolutely, and what Martin was saying about the opportunity to drive down food prices obviously plays into exactly the same space. Resham, You asked me asked us what one policy we would like in the Brexit negotiations. This isn't actually a policy that I would like in the Brexit negotiations, but it is a policy I would like considered by the UK Cabinet over the next budget and spending reviews, and that is to extend the reinvestment that has been put into tax credits into the universal credit work allowances, and that we cannot have a system whereby in 2018-19 suddenly this exact group of just managing people suddenly experience a drop in their wages, and these are people who are doing exactly the right thing. They're in work, they're working all the hours. So that would be my one ask. On the employers question, the CSJ is about to publish a report on business for the social good, and one of the points that it makes is that companies who choose to invest in their workforce may not see returns in year one, but by year 3 they are doing better than those who actually are trying to employ at the lowest wages with the lowest levels of training. So actually, business for the social good and an ethical approach to business and a real investment in workforce actually delivers long-term returns for the company.
Right, Julia. One of the biggest challenges for British business is productivity, and we've talked about that, but equally big is the problem of engagement and staff engagement. Every business you talk to talks about the importance of employee engagement. There is a very real risk that the sort of crony capitalism that Legarton have talked about drives out that engagement, and that's coincided with a change at the bottom end of our labour market, which has produced some deeply insecure and very precarious work, which is why I think the Prime Minister is absolutely right to commission an inquiry into what can be done about it. First test I would apply, and I'm afraid I'm not going to come up with one silver bullet, is can the negotiations result in protections in the labour market that are appropriate for the modern day and for the modern labour market. We don't need all the protections that we used to have, we will need different protections, and I think that's going to be incredibly important to satisfy the 52%. Second thing I'd like to say is I think you're absolutely right to talk about costs. The costs facing poorer households are one of the biggest things driving people into poverty. And it's the costs that are part of the negotiations that Brexit will allow us to discuss, but they're also the costs of huge costs of housing, of childcare, of food, which somebody mentioned earlier, but also of access to fuel. We know the poverty premium, which was talked about first 40 years ago, is bigger now than it ever was. So emphasis on cost would be the second thing that we'd look to. And the third is to recognise the differences between different parts of the UK. That the experience of being poor in different parts of the UK will be very different because of the opportunities that you have. We have to find ways of rebalancing that. I think it's through the cities using their economic power.
Thank you, Julia. James.
Yeah, no, just to try and bring them all together, I mean, this point about the cry of frustration, I think the cry of frustration comes when you treat, which economists have a tendency to do, human capital as equivalent to other forms of capital. If you're an economist, it makes perfect sense to drive down all costs of capital, because then the end product, is cheaper. But if one of those things has, to use your word, dignity, the dignity of the human soul, then the driving down of that cost comes at a profound cost of a broken, divided society. And so the message of this is you can't treat humans like any other bit of capital. Yes, we absolutely need to use the EU, the exiting EU, to drive down the cost of capital, or factors of production, the cost of living and so on. But the reason that we are in this position is because the opinion was that humans should be part of that equation, and they absolutely must not be part of that equation. The one thing, just to your point, which I do think is critical, is particularly critical as to the coming out of the EU, which has nothing to do with the EU regulation, but it is to do with social reform, which is around housing. This is an incredibly difficult policy, always, for the Conservative Party, which, generally speaking, has not, or rather in periods of its history, has been very anti-building more housing. It is clearly one of the biggest sources of inequity in the country, particularly intergenerational. And I really, really hope that Theresa May will be extremely brave. Indeed, Sajid Javid has been signifying he's going to be very brave on housing in terms of driving down the cost of something which the main bulk of the cost is driven by land, and the cost of land is mainly driven by regulation. There is no particular natural reason why our housing is so expensive. and it could be a lot cheaper, and that would have a tremendous effect on people's cost of living.
Thank you. Now, Martin, that wasn't a very legal question. Would you like to answer that, or should we demand of the floor that we have a bespoke question for you?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I've got something to say on the
Please.
issue of Brexit's opportunity to reduce costs, and obviously I've already mentioned the subject of tariffs being in control of our external trade policy, particularly in the area of food. But there is actually a wider opportunity which will be given to us by Brexit. Because one area where I think the European Union has actually been successful is in terms of breaking down barriers between the markets of member states, allowing goods and services to flow more freely across borders, resulting in lower costs. The problem with the European Union is that it's been very bad about goods and services flowing across the external border. Indeed, it creates barriers. And one thing that we could do, and I think we should do, on leaving the European Union, is actually to take the current rules that apply on the importation of goods and services from other member states and unilaterally apply them to the importation of goods and services from any other country in the world. And hopefully that should produce a major reduction in some of the costs, both the 20% at the bottom and the more aspirant or people you asked us to mention, and get rid of this sort of situation where things like branded goods and programs cost the same in numbers of